To our presentations. Our first speaker today is, sorry, my screen's just frozen. Our first speaker today is Dr. Saffron Karlsen, who is a senior lecturer in the School for Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. Saffron's work aims to enable a better understanding of the different ways in which ethnicity has meaning and relevance in people's lives, both for developing awareness of potential group affiliations and as a driver of health and other inequalities. It engages particularly with the negative impact of forms of racist victimization in these processes. And recently, she's been working on a project documenting the specific impact on BAME communities during the pandemic and its associated lockdown in Bristol and the Southwest to identify specific needs and therefore inform context-driven interventions. So I'll hand over to you now, Saffron.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I shall just try and share my screen. Not very effectively. Right. So I assume everyone can see that, and I seem to be blocking the. Okay. So good afternoon. I wanted to start with something of a disclaimer, because I appreciate that this is an afternoon dedicated to understanding the effects of poverty, but I'm not actually going to say a huge amount about poverty in my talk. Obviously, I'm aware that we've got a range of presenters this afternoon, and what I thought I would do is to try and give you an overview of the evidence regarding the presence and explanations for ethnic inequalities in coronavirus in the UK, to try and show how the work of sort of several of the presenters that we'll hear today and working on inequalities in the UK sort of fits together, and why we need all of this information in order to get a sense of how to address these inequalities. So we began receiving evidence that there were ethnic inequalities in coronavirus from the US at the beginning of the year. And that was quickly supplemented by data from the UK. So the first coronavirus deaths that we saw in the UK were among Black and Muslim doctors and other health workers. And then data started to come out which showed higher rates among ethnic minority populations in the UK more generally. So now we've got evidence from a range of sources which consistently shows that many of those with minority ethnicities in the UK are significantly more likely to be infected by and also to die from coronavirus than those from white groups. And so here on this slide, this chart, we've got an example of some of this data. So this is from a recent release from the ONS, and it shows age standardized death rates from coronavirus between an early part of May. So what we can see on this chart is a range of ethnic groups listed on the left, and then their rates of death from coronavirus is shown in the horizontal bars on the right. Obviously, I'm aware that we've got a range of different people with different expertise on the call today, so I tried to sort of make this as easy to engage with as possible. I mean, basically, the important thing to reflect on is that all of those groups that have, if you look at the line sort of going towards the right, all of those groups with rates which go to the right of the red line, and particularly where that includes the sort of the thin black lines that you can see, they have an increased risk of death from coronavirus compared to white men in the UK. So what we can see from this graph is that men and women with Bangladeshi and Pakistani backgrounds, men and women from different black groups, men and women in Indian groups, and men and women in other ethnic groups all have a statistically significantly higher rate of death from coronavirus. And I should sort of say here as well that for those of us who've been working in this area of ethnic health inequalities for a long time, these differences weren't very surprising. So these are patterns which are very similar to ethnic inequalities in other health conditions, although not necessarily for the reasons that you might expect. So these early figures, not surprisingly, started a conversation about what might be driving these patterns. And these explanations and conversations fell into three sort of broad groups. So first of all, we had a set of conversations very early on about the influence of different cultural behaviours. So Trevor Phillips, right at the beginning, was arguing that there was a protective effect caused by the fact that Muslims washed their hands a lot. So Muslims wash their hands more than other people, and that enabled some sort of protection against coronavirus. There's no actual evidence to support this as an explanation, and indeed we now know that actually Muslims are more at risk of infections from and deaths from coronavirus than many other ethnic groups. And we've also heard a lot of discussion about the role of genetics and biology. So people have talked about the role of differences in vitamin D. This has also been fairly debunked as an explanation, particularly for these inequalities. But we've also heard a lot of conversation. There's been a lot of attention given to the role of comorbidities. So the fact that we might have ethnic differences in heart disease or diabetes, and that these in some way sort of explain these variations either in infections or in death. One of the most useful investigations into this evidence was produced by Dr. Lubaba Mamluk and Dr. Tim Jones from ARC West in the University of Bristol Medical School, and this was a report that was commissioned by Bristol City Council, and their findings are shown here in this figure. So their research found that actually the impact of comorbidities on risk of death from coronavirus was actually very small, so much smaller than the impression that you get from the amount of conversation there was about this as a potential driving factor. Structural factors, by contrast, were very much more important. So these structural factors put people more at risk of coming into contact with people with the coronavirus. So those with minority ethnicities, we know, are more likely to be in key worker roles or other essential roles. They're more likely to rely on public transport. And these factors also affect the strength or the resilience that people have to manage an infection once they get it. So the ways in which these structural factors can impact on people's outcomes and experiences of coronavirus are sort of multifaceted. And you can see from the chart here some of the different ways that socioeconomic inequalities can influence coronavirus. As I say, this is a figure from Lubaba and Tim's report. But I imagine that this is something that Andrea is going to talk a lot about in her presentation, so I won't go into too much detail in terms of some of these interrelationships. That said, what I will mention some research that we've had published quite recently in sociology, in the Sociology Journal, and that shows that ethnic variations in occupational position and employment status have persisted since the 1970s, and for some groups are getting worse. So this isn't a problem that's improving over time. And I also want to mention here that these structural inequalities are not only important because of their impact on coronavirus. As Kira will explain, these have also led to a number of other problems which disproportionately affect ethnic minority communities in lockdown, and which it's really important that we give attention to. But what I did want to draw your attention to is the interrelationships between these different influences. So that these aren't three separate broad sets of explanations, but actually there are also important interrelationships between them which we need to be reflective of. So often what are presented as cultural and biological influences on coronavirus risk are also at least partly structural in origin. So for example, overcrowding has been found to play a very important explanatory role in the development of these inequalities and others. But this overcrowding has often been presented as a problem caused by cultural preferences for intergenerational households among some groups, rather than a financial problem. But obviously, even if people want to share a house with their grandma, they don't very often want to share a room with them, let alone a bed with them. So whilst there might be cultural influences which are affecting this situation, it's actually an economic problem that we need to give attention to. We can't be sort of distracted away from these economic effects by assumptions around these sort of potentially cultural behaviours. There's also this assumption that differences in cardiovascular disease or diabetes are caused by genetic factors, when actually the evidence is that socioeconomic disadvantage can actually explain these differences between different ethnic groups. And also, if we think about the government's new drive to cut obesity, so dietary factors just can't be separated from the impact that poverty has on food choices. And it's hard to get fit if you don't have a local park or if you can't afford the gym. So some of this research has statistically adjusted for some of the socioeconomic differences. And invariably, some differences by ethnicity remain in these analyses even after these adjustments have been made. And this also encourages people to focus on other explanations, so the genes, biology, culture, behaviours, as an explanation. So on the assumption that all the socioeconomic differences between ethnic groups have been removed in these methods. But there are actually methodological problems with adjusting for socioeconomic differences across ethnic groups, which means that these approaches can't always be relied upon. So most of the measures that we currently use to adjust for socioeconomic position are actually developed on a sort of white majority male experience. So they don't account for the ways in which biases and other societal factors limit the lives of women and people with minority ethnicities and religions, and therefore limits the relevance of these measures and their capacity to actually remove these different effects in these sorts of models. So they assume that people with the same educations get the same jobs and get the same incomes for those jobs. Whereas some work that James Nasra and I have done show that the average incomes of Bangladeshi and Pakistani people in Registrar General Social Class 1 are actually lower than those of white people. So that's the highest group, supposedly with the highest incomes, are actually lower than those of white people in social class 5, which is supposedly the lowest group. And now I know that we don't particularly sort of use the Registrar General Social Class measure so much these days, but these are problems that can also be identified elsewhere too. And these markers also can't always account for the vulnerabilities that exist between people living on the peripheries of these categories, and which also vary by ethnicity. So Professor Christina Pantasis and I did some work with the Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey a little while ago, and this shows that Black Caribbean households were less likely to be below the poverty line than other groups, but were actually much more likely to live with the permanent threat of poverty and to have made serious sacrifices to stay just on the other side. So those sorts of economic ethnic variations will not be being taken account for in these sorts of approaches. And then there are other sort of subtle differences. So we know that people with minority ethnicities are more likely to be key workers, but we also now know, or there's emerging evidence, that within those key worker roles, people with ethnic minority backgrounds may be less likely to have had access to PPE. They may be in particular roles which put them more at risk, even compared to other key workers. So there are certain sort of aspects of the lived experience of many people, not only those with minority ethnicities, that are not recognised in these measures. And this can distort our understanding of what's going on, and it also lulls us into a false sense of security in the analyses that we're doing and the things that they're actually able to tell us. And then there are also a number of problems related to the use of some fairly clumsy measures of ethnicity, which we're seeing a lot. We see a lot in studies of ethnicity more generally, but they also affect the evidence that we're seeing around coronavirus. So we can say very little about people's experiences when we're using measures like BAME or Black or Asian or even Black African or Indian, So there are big differences between the experiences of people within these categories, and we really need to explore that in more detail if we're actually going to introduce policies or other sort of support mechanisms to address them. So to get to the bottom of all of this, we really need better markers. But what explains these variations? As Michael Marmot would say, what are the causes of these causes? So I do think skin colour is significant in all this, but it's not skin colour as a marker for other genetic or biological risks. Instead, these inequalities arise out of the reaction of other people in society to certain people's skin colour, or the assumptions they make about people's skin colour, their culture, or other markers of ethnicity and what that means about their capacities. So it's the effects of ongoing and historical racism that's often described in the literature as ethnic penalty, which explains the concentration of people with ethnic minority backgrounds in socioeconomic disadvantage, poorer educations, worse jobs, lower incomes. It's the institutional racism in the housing sector which prevents people from getting good houses. It's the fear of interpersonal racism which stops people with black or brown skins moving to otherwise nicer areas. It's these institutional and interpersonal racisms. So living in a society where the Prime Minister calls people like you pickaninnies or letterboxes and still gets elected, which produce the greater stress, which causes these high rates of heart disease. There is racism in healthcare, which prevent people getting the care that they need. Assumptions about how people with certain ethnicities describe symptoms or tolerate pain, many of which were also used to justify slavery, or whether people will be able or willing to comply with treatment regimens and how those affect their care. So going forward, there are things we must recognise. Racism is multiple, historical, and the worst of it is often hidden. In coronavirus, we see the legacies of racisms committed long before these people were even born, but which still impact on their bodies as well as their own lived experience. It will take work to recognise the scale of these effects, but just because it's hard to spot doesn't mean it's not there or that we should ignore it. We must accept that these racisms produce very particular problems, such as the concerns with current plans for track and trace, which Dr. Catherine Dodds from SBS describes in this recent BMJ editorial. We need to recognise that many of us cannot have insight into these processes, and therefore we can't be the ones to lead this particular charge. As such, we need to stop assuming that we can make reasonable decisions on other people's behalves. We have to give people a seat at the table and enable them to tell their own stories. The approach to the pandemic and the lockdown has assumed that we all live extremely middle-class lives, and this is simply ridiculous. To begin with, we have to recognise that these inequalities are caused by a problem in society and commit to doing something about it. It is not something explained by who people with ethnic minority backgrounds are or what they do. We can no longer blame the victims. Those of us with privilege must use it to hold people to account, to make change happen, and to elevate unheard voices. One thing's for sure, if we're serious, the statues are only the start. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Saffron. That was really, really fascinating presentation and really, really thought-provoking. So happy to open the floor up now to questions. We've got about 8 minutes till we want to move on to the next speaker at most. So fire away with your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. Just waiting for them to come through. Just not a question, but we have a comment from Noah who just wants to say thank you, Saffron. That was a really brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed it. So, so yeah, thank you on behalf of all of us, really. So through is from Gillian Ashmore, who asks, are there any areas where you can elaborate on your data?
Yes. Are there any? I mean, obviously, if I start talking on this topic, I'll be going on for a lot more than 8 minutes. So are there, I mean, I think obviously Kira and Andrea and other presenters will be providing some more detail. So I think, you know, the evidence around ethnic inequalities in sort of socioeconomic position in a range of different ways will be covered in their presentations. But yeah, so can you be more specific in terms of the particular?
Yeah, so she's has just sent a follow-on comment through saying that we need to differentiate between different BAME groups.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Gillian, did you want to elaborate on that any further, or do you feel that answer is dealt with the query that we picked up in later presentations?
Yeah.
So she's asked, for example, are there any examples of the differences between those groups?
In terms of, so there are differences in terms of the sort of outcomes of coronavirus, as I sort of showed on the chart. There are so as a
perhaps it might be something we can put you in touch afterwards if there's.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. The report that I showed from Lubaba Mamluk and Tim Jones is available online. So in terms of sort of unpacking some of those variations, that may be a useful place to start. And there are also a number of reports that I showed on the first slide, which also provide more sort of detailed discussion of what's happening. So we do, and some of that has sort of shown the varying impacts of sort of adjusting for socioeconomic position on the variations in sort of infections and deaths that we see. But I think there are also, and you know, the impacts of different forms of disadvantage will affect different groups in different ways. But we do see this sort of, there is also this consistency in terms of the ways in which these processes sort of operate across different groups, which is sort of consistent with the idea that these are sort of racially motivated and they're underpinned by sort of structural discrimination and racism, because it has this sort of quite this sort of particular impact on people with non-white backgrounds.
Great, thank you. And yeah, Gillian, if you had any further questions, if you want to get in touch with Bristol Policy Institute, and then I can put you in touch with Saffron if that's helpful, if you wanted to follow up that discussion. We've had quite a few more questions come through in the meantime, so I'll get to as many of those as I can. First one is from Paul Fox, who is the head of the government's Money and Pensions Service in the South West. So just wondering if you had any regional statistics for the South West that he might be able to source to support these discussions.
So it may, I don't know whether it's something that Kira may have evidence on. Obviously, this is something that they've been looking at as part of Black Southwest Network. There's a certain amount of difficulty with sourcing data, sourcing regional data. So we've been recently doing some research looking at the regional data available as part of the race disparity audit. And we can say certain things at regional level, but it's also quite disappointing that a lot of the data that's available nationally isn't available at regional level. But I think some of the work that Bristol City Council are currently doing is to try and establish some of the differences. So we hope And also coronavirus, this is still a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of research. Normally the research process is much slower, and sort of getting hold of the evidence and releasing the evidence takes a while. So we're still playing catch up to a certain extent, but hopefully these figures will be available shortly.
Great, thank you. And we did have another question from Sabitha, who was asking if there's any data on Bristol specifically, which I think we've kind of covered in your response there. Yeah. So thank you for your question, Sabitha, and she also thanked you for your excellent presentation. Next question we've got also starts with thank you for the great presentation. It's from Sabby Redwood, who asks, where do we start, especially in relation to health inequalities? She's aware it's a tricky question, but just wondered if there's any indications of where to start in the evidence, and specifically in terms of where do we start to reverse the juggernaut of discrimination?
Yeah. So I think where we don't start is having another inquiry. I think we know what's going on. I think the parallels between what's happening with coronavirus and what we know from other health inequalities, as Sabby knows as well as I do, given her excellent work in the area. You know, we already have a very good insight into where to start. It's just having the commitment and the willingness to actually do what it takes. I've been very impressed with work that I'm currently involved with in Bristol City Council, because they are very much acknowledging the role of exploitation and colonialism and structural disadvantage in the drivers of these ethnic differences and the experiences of the pandemic, and have a large sort of stakeholder group or a steering group of many stakeholders discussing, establishing the evidence and discussing appropriate responses to the evidence, which is very hopeful. So I think we speak to people. We don't make assumptions about what's happening in people's lives. We also speak to them about what would be helpful and how we can best go about support them. And then we do our best to try and make some of those serious long-term changes.
Great, thank you. So I've got a few more questions. Probably not going to have time to get to all of them, but we might be able to circle back when we get to the open presentation at the end. And I see actually a couple of them might be answered by the presentations that are coming up as well, particularly ones asking about impacts by ethnic categories in other countries. So we can circle back to that, please. Circle back to that later. So just one final question I'll come to, and then we'll move on. You spoke about racism being multiple. This is from Georgia Marks, who's just wondering if you have any comments on the impacts of issues of intersectionality and how this can impact on experiences more negatively.
I mean, yes, undoubtedly. I think, again, this is something that we need to explore in more detail. So we know that there are age variations in terms of the impact of coronavirus, although actually, yet again, it seems that socioeconomic factors can explain a lot of those age differences as well. And obviously, the sort of combination of variations by gender and variations by ethnicity are important. I mean, it's interesting because if we assume that sort of sexism disadvantages women, the evidence around coronavirus suggests that actually men are more likely to die from coronavirus, although that does actually follow the pattern that we see with other health differences. So, but I think it's in terms of sort of understanding some of these sort of the nuances and the subtleties, both in terms of understanding how these sort of lived lives vary between these different individuals according to these different intersectional characteristics, and also understanding how we support people, which draw attention to the multiplicity of this sort of disadvantage.
Great, thank you very much. That was really fascinating and really valuable. I'm just sorry we can't go through all the questions at the moment, but we will hopefully be able to circle back to them, but just need to move on to our next speaker now.